30 engineers had been working in shifts for 3 days straight. Screens glowed red. Keyboards clicked like heartbeats. Money, real, counted in reais money, was bleeding out by the hour. And the last person anyone expected to help was a delivery girl with a yellow thermal backpack and 3 sealed processors tucked under her arm. Maia Santos stood for a moment in the building's atrium, the cool São Paulo morning pushing through the glass doors behind her. The lobby smelled of cold coffee and cleaner. Fluorescent lights hummed above a sea of anxious faces, the kind of faces that look like they haven't slept and are trying not to believe what their dashboards are saying. At 24, Maia had learned to hold herself steady in rooms where everyone else assumed she did not belong. She'd graduated at the top of her systems engineering class at USP, but graduation had not opened the doors she'd hoped. Months of callbacks that stopped at "We're keeping your CV" had led to a stack of unpaid bills and a decision she never wanted for herself: night shifts on a delivery app to pay rent and keep her mother's house from slipping into debt. The yellow backpack had become part of her uniform, a shield, a work tool, a chess piece in a game she hadn't planned to play. Today she was delivering processors to TechFlow Solutions. The company's logo, a streamlined blue spiral, was on the glass. Inside, screens that usually glinted with predictive analytics and product dashboards were instead frozen on a single damning line: 504 Gateway Timeout. If you have seen that message on a website, it's the internet's equivalent of a long silence. A server didn't get a response from another server in time, so it gave up and told the requester, "I can't reach the place that can answer this." For a company like TechFlow, built on microservices and fast API calls, a cascade of 504s was like traffic lights failing across a city during rush hour. Requests stacked up, users retried, transactions failed, everything slowed, until, in some parts, nothing moved at all. Maia handed her pack to the receptionist, a woman named Carla, who had counted change in the same lobby for years, and who, by the second day of outages, had the weary patience of someone holding one end of a rope 2 floors below a machine room where everything was on fire. Carla gave Maia a look that said, "Please, not today," but she smiled politely and buzzed the Velizny signature system with her thumb. The corridor to TechFlow's command center was quieter than Maia expected. Monitors lined the room like rows of sleep-focused pilots. Engineers sat like constellations, clusters of code reflected in their pupils. She felt the tension settle into her bones, and old, almost chemical knowledge of crisis rooms. Panic moves differently in professionals. It becomes precise, quick, and a little cruel. People stopped making eye contact.
The CEO, Ricardo Mendez, was there, his suit a shade too dark for the lighting, his hands clasped behind his back, surrounded by a circle of advisors and a whiteboard scribbled with numbers and angry arrows. He looked like a man trying to hold a bowl of water without letting a single drop fall. Maia was supposed to be invisible, a signature, a thanks, and out the door. She signed, collected the processors, and turned toward the glass that hid the operations room. A young engineer, Carlos, one of the team leads, a face she'd seen in LinkedIn photos during her job search, was half turned toward the window. His expression shifted when he noticed her standing there, the yellow pack, the packaged processors. For a second, he met her curiosity with the kind of recognition that happens when someone sees another person who could have been a peer. "Are you all right?" he asked, halfway between professional courtesy and the soft curiosity of someone who misses the clearer days of work. Maia kept it short. "I'm fine, delivering. Everything okay in there?" He gave a small, tired laugh. "Depends on what you mean by okay. We've been fighting a 504 that won't quit. Most of the cluster is throttling. Requests are timing out. It's been 36 hours since the first big spike. We can't find the choke point." Her fingers brushed the edge of the backpack strap. For months she had practiced the smallest routines: how to steady a delivery box on a bumpy scooter, how to make a new acquaintance in 30 seconds when doors only ever opened that fast. She knew to listen first. She asked one question that came out like a reflex from late-night study sessions in the university lab. "Have you checked whether the problem rhythms line up with some resource exhaustion? Like, do the error spikes correlate with database connection usage?" Carlos blinked. "Database pool uses? Of course. Just," she said, softening, "it's just that sometimes systems look everywhere, but not at what's being reused. Connections, caches. If there's a leak, the pool saturates and everything behind it slows down." She sighed inwardly at how plain she sounded. She'd learned to strip technical phrases down to their bones for people who hadn't slept. But the room had been a pressure cooker for so long that any deviation from their calibration of the problem could feel like criticism. Engineers were exhausted and fragile in a professional way.
Someone else at the glass, Marcelo, a senior engineer whose name was on 3 internal RFCs and who looked like he'd aged a decade in the last week, turned, lips curling into a smile that barely hid annoyance. We're not leaking connections. We've instrumented the pool. We traced queries. We scaled horizontally. We tested timeout values. He said this like a litany meant to close conversation. Thanks for the delivery. Maya felt the sting of dismissal like cold rain.
But that sting also sharpened something in her that had been dormant through months of job rejection, an exactness. She could see details the exhausted eye had missed, because exhaustion favors the spectacular, switches, retries, scaling, over the small, persistent things. She stepped closer to the glass and asked, "Where are you looking for the leak? Are you checking exception paths? Sometimes an early return can skip cleanup logic." That pulled a few heads. The room's rhythm shifted. Marcelo's jaw tightened. Carlos' curiosity turned into attention. Across the whiteboard, the board members murmured. The CEO's face hardened. Ricardo Mendez came out of his circle and walked toward the reception like a man closing a case. His voice, when he addressed Maya, was the voice of someone used to being obeyed. "Miss, this is a very delicate operation. This room is closed. We have the best engineers here." Maya kept her voice low but steady. "I understand. I'm only a delivery person. I'm not—" "No," Ricardo cut in, the word a barrier. "You're not, and you shouldn't be. This is a high-stakes environment." He turned, speaking to his board with the bluntness of a man worn raw. "We've tried everything. If there's a solution outside the box, bring it forward, but we can't have interruptions." Carlos, a line between two worlds now, cleared his throat. Maybe she has an angle. She's systems engineering, USP? That name, USP, was a soft counterweight. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a credential. A few people in the room swapped looks, the kind of looks that had to reconcile exhaustion with the possibility that someone unfamiliar could offer a fresh lens. Ricardo's hand found his watch. He was a man of timed decisions. "All right," he said finally, with the kind of calculation that precedes action. "We've had 30 engineers and a dozen external consultants. If anyone, thinks they can prove a cause and a fix, show it, but we need results fast. I won't have people wandering in and out." He looked at Maya with a thin blade of challenge. "If you have something, you have 30 minutes to show us proof. Otherwise, thank you for the delivery and leave it to the team." Maya's mouth went dry. The room seemed to condense around the watch on Ricardo's wrist, and for a moment the air was measured in seconds. 30 minutes felt like the exact number that separated heroic possibility from theatrical spectacle. It was a public, sharp, and humiliating test, the kind of ultimatum Ricardo used to force choices in boardrooms, a demonstration of whether an outsider's idea would stand up. It was also the kind of pressure that created clarity. She could have walked away. She had a life that demanded pragmatism. She could keep delivering, keep keeping the bills at bay, and let the professionals handle the server failure.
But she'd been carrying fragments of this problem in the back of her head since she signed the delivery sheet. Little academic echoes about exception handling and resource cleanup. It wasn't bravado that pushed her forward. It was a quiet obligation not to let the obvious go unexamined. 30 minutes, she said. She heard her voice more steady than she felt. "I accept." A hush hit the room. The journalists in the back, some of TechFlow's PR people trying not to look like they wanted the drama milked into a headline, shifted. Marcelo's mouth opened and closed once, as if adjusting to the fact of an unexpected opponent. Carlos looked like someone who had seen the scenario unfold in 100 different training simulations, and never like this, an outsider in a yellow backpack offering a scalpel to a patient everyone thought beyond saving. Ricardo's nod was not a concession, it was a stake. 30 minutes. Go. Someone brought a laptop to the glass, thin light reflected off the keys. Engineer stepped aside with an almost involuntary politeness, like letting a stranger into someone else's home. Maya wasn't allowed into the closed room, not at first. Protocol and liability were real barriers. But the CTO, Patricia Moreira, recognized that the optics of a woman with a delivery bag being pushed out in front of a crowd could become a news cycle of its own. She gestured to a spare desk in the glass-fronted situation room and pushed a monitor toward Maya. The team would execute any changes. Maya would only guide them. That division of labor kept procedures intact and let her voice be heard. At the monitor, Maya breathed in a count of 3 and then looked. Logs are a language. They make a rhythm over time. The console showed a stream of requests, tiny timestamps following one another. At first, the numbers looked like a storm cloud on a screen, random, furious. But Maya's mind liked rhythm. It liked the kind of pattern that could be missed when one is fighting 100 fires, repetition that repeats across unseen scales. She asked for the connection pool metrics. Somebody pulled up a graph, number of active connections over time, allocation versus saturation. Maya's finger traced the curve. The graph climbed, dipped, climbed again, each climb ending in a plateau correlated with a spike to 504s, then a slow rise. Connections that didn't fall as they should after load peaks. Instead, they accumulated.
"It's like water tanks," she said, in a voice meant for the overheard. "If the taps occasionally leak, the tanks slowly fill, and eventually there isn't room for new flow. Requests queue up and then time out." It was a simple metaphor, but an instantly visual one. The senior engineers exchanged looks. None of them loved the idea of their complex architectures being compared to household plumbing, but metaphors are tools for the worried brain. "Where are the orphan connections?" Carlos asked aloud, the word hitting the room like a keycard.
Orphan connections are exactly what they sound like. Database sessions opened by a process that never properly closed them. Over time, they build up, occupying slots in the pool that should be used for new transactions. Under heavy load, the pool hits its maximum and won't accept new connections. So incoming requests queue, and the gateway between services eventually gives up, returning that 504 error. Maia's eyes moved to the logs where stack traces were printed, then to the code snippets that had been copied into a temporary scratchpad. "Check exception routes," she said. "Look for early returns, where an exception causes the function to exit before it runs the cleanup. If closing logic lives after a return or in a section that can be skipped, connections don't get closed." Someone brought up an error trace labeled from a reporting endpoint, a long-running query that aggregated user data for analytics dashboards. The query itself ran as expected, but during an error case, like a timeout in a downstream microservice, the request aborted. In Java and many other languages, resource cleanup is often put in a special part of the code, a finally block, code that should execute no matter how the rest of the function exits. If a return or an exception skips that section because the code paths were written with the happy path in mind, then resources remain open. Maia leaned closer. Her fingers hovered over the keys but didn't press them. She didn't need to type to direct. She needed to observe, argue the thought, and let the team own the execution. The room listened because she spoke the exact low-lit language of instruments and logs. "Look at this sequence," she said, pointing to a slice of logs where the timestamped spikes lined up at 2-minute intervals. Every time that reporting job runs, there's a small cluster of connection opens that don't seem to close. The reporting job handles retries and sometimes times out on downstream services. In the exception branch, it returns earlier than it should. The close method executes only on the normal path. If this function is hit repeatedly, it's going to eat the pool. Marcelo folded his arms, then after a short silence, nodded once. "We wrote that reporting job under pressure months ago," he admitted. "There were edge cases we left with it to do. I never thought they'd have this impact at scale." The admission landed in the room as if a physical weight had been put down. Maia felt a flicker of empathy for him. Exhaustion had a way of making people do expedient things. "It's not blame," she said. "It's a pattern. The metric curve shows accumulation over time, and the connection pool maxes out during those reporting windows. If we ensure closure in all flows and reduce the idle timeout temporarily, the pool won't saturate so quickly while we patch the code." Patricia sat forward, the CFO who had been watching numbers and breathing through them. Her voice was a careful instrument.
"What do you mean by reduce idle timeout?" Maia drew a small diagram on the tablet the engineers had passed her. "Think of the pool as a set of chairs. Idle timeout determines how long an empty chair stays reserved before being released for future guests. Lowering the timeout means chairs are released sooner, reducing the chance of a full house. That would be a safety valve," she explained, "a temporary setting that could buy time while they change the code so connections close reliably." "This is a two-pronged plan," she said. "Short term, tighten the pool's idle timeout and reduce the maximum weight so the system fails fast and drains sooner. Long term, fix the code so the close executes on every path. Move the closure into a finally equivalent block. That will stop new leaks." Ricardo watched her with a look that was somewhere between skepticism and hope. Publicly setting a 30-minute ultimatum was his way of clearing the room. He hadn't meant for a delivery worker to actually pin a plausible theory to the problem. The board members shifted, and someone in legal muttered about change control. In a high-pressure production environment, even the suggestion of altering connection pool settings could be fraught. The wrong tweak could collapse performance or invalidate transactional integrity. Carlos, who had become an unexpected ally, met her eyes. "We can log the offending sessions," he said. "If we can find the thread IDs and the code path, we can instrument the fix in staging and push a hotfix to production in a controlled way." Maia nodded. "Check the application logs for session IDs and the reporting job's correlation IDs. Match them to the DB's active sessions. If we can identify the exact return path that skips cleanup, we can write a small patch now. No big refactor, just move the resource closure into a finally block, then tighten the idle timeout as a safety net." Marcelo swallowed. "If deploy goes wrong, we lose more," he said. His voice did not have the edge it had an hour ago. It had turned smaller, more human. "But if we watch metrics closely and roll it as a small hotfix, we might avoid ripple effects." There was something tender in the way the room shifted from defensive to collaborative. Exhaustion loosened into a focused adrenaline. People who had not slept, who had been stuck on the same set of assumptions, suddenly found a new axis to pivot on. What had felt like a problem of scale was at its heart a problem of resource accounting, and Maia, by listening to the pattern of logs and translating it into a sequence of probable causes, had offered not a miracle but a method: observe, hypothesize, test. Ricardo stepped back and said, more softly than anyone had heard him earlier, 30 minutes then, prove it. The TTO pointed to a whiteboard where a circle had been drawn and divided into time slices. The team had 60 minutes of operational windows and strict compliance around deployment.
30 minutes for proof meant they would have to compress validation and push the change in a way that minimized risk. It meant monitoring, rollback plans, and faith in each other's hands. Maia's heart thundered in her ears. It was not fear of failure that made her hands tremble. It was the acute human sense that a decision here would ripple into livelihoods, into reputations, into rent checks and reputations, and a company's ability to pay salaries next month. She could not make it smaller. She only had to make it precise. She thought of the delivery routes, of pauses at red lights where time bent, and she tried to imagine schedules like networks, nodes, intervals, and the ineffable small failures that cause cascades. She kept her voice calm, and she spoke like someone reading a rhythm rather than reciting a formula. Instrument the reporting job first, she said. We need to see which thread IDs correspond to OpenDB sessions. Add logs that emit correlation IDs and session close events. Then apply the closure patch in a small scope. Don't touch the query logic yet. And while that runs, reduce the pool's idle timeout from, say, 2 minutes to 30 seconds as a temporary measure. That short-term change prevents saturation while the code fix takes effect. Carlos began issuing commands, clear, precise. Get me the session traces. I'll coordinate the instrumentation. Marcelo, help me with the hotfix, and Patricia, sign off on the emergency change control. I'll run the deploy and monitor the metrics. Patricia hesitated, then tapped her tablet and swiped approval. We'll log the sign-off for later audit, she said. Her words were both a concession and a shield. They brought legal compliance into the room and reduced the risk of a later finger-pointing session. She looked at Maia with a new sort of respect. If this works, you'll have saved us a lot. Maia wanted to ask for nothing, no title, no reward. Her head buzzed with the simple, immediate task. The team moved as a unit now. Their exhaustion turned into a kind of focused choreography. The engineers handled the mechanical parts, instrumentation, small refactor to move close logic, adjusting pool settings. Maia guided the interpretation, pointing to timestamps and lining up correlation IDs on one screen while the team cross-checked DB session tables on another. Time itself seemed to sharpen into a single visible thing. Someone pulled up a digital stopwatch on a second monitor. Ricardo's face was unreadable. The board members clustered around a tablet, lips pursed. Outside the glass, the lobby carried on. Life, deliveries, the invisible hum of the city. Inside, the storm tightened. At 15 minutes into the clock, Carlos found the first correlation, a set of session IDs that had been opened by the reporting job and had not closed. The session rows in the database showed connection start times and no corresponding end times.
The graph of active connections crested like a tide and then refused to fall. Here, Carlos said, voice that had been hoarse a while ago, now finding its clarity. These sessions started at 11:02, 11:04, and 11:06. Notice the reporting task runs every 2 minutes. Each run opens 3 or 4 sessions. In healthy runs, sessions close within seconds. These aren't closing. He tapped the screen, and the room leaned over the numbers like people leaning to hear a faraway wave. Marcelo opened the code path and scrolled to the function where the reporting job wrapped interaction with a downstream aggregator. It was messy, not malicious, just pragmatic. Try-catch blocks nested in ways that made readability poor, and the finally block that should close secondary connections was reachable only from one of the branches. In another branch, the function would return early when a timeout occurred, bypassing the closure. Maia watched him read. Her fingers clenched once on the edge of the desk, not in triumph, but as if she had held on to that small fact all this time, that complexity often hides in exception paths, because exception paths are rarely the happy path of documentation. Move the connection close into a finally equivalent, she said quietly. Make sure it executes no matter what. Marcelo looked up. For a second, the weight of the last 3 days, of pride, of being called to account, was visible in his posture. Then he nodded. I'll write the minimal change. We'll run it in staging first and keep the idle timeout reduced. If the sessions close and the graph starts to fall, we'll know. 17 minutes into the countdown, the team created a branch, committed the tiny refactor, and ran a build. The build pipelines at TechFlow guarded. No change went to production without passing tests. But this was an emergency hotfix. The staging environment mirrored production closely enough for an initial validation. The team executed the patch in staging and watched logs for the first signs of relief. The staging metrics were promising.
The active connections curve that had seemed to clutch at its ceiling now dipped after the reporting jobs with closure events logged at the expected times. Engineers let out the kind of breaths that had been held for hours. It was a small, critical victory, and it bought the team the justification to proceed. Back in the operations room, someone projected a plan for a controlled production patch, incremental rollout, monitor for anomalies, rollback triggers defined. The legal and compliance team sent quick messages via chat confirming the emergency change control. Patricia approved funds for any immediate risk mitigation. On the glass side, Ricardo watched the plans as if verifying the orbit of a satellite. "Execute," he said, softly. It was not an order now, but recognition that the room had become a momentum machine. Maia's throat was dry.
She had been careful to maintain the division of labor. Diagnose, recommend, let the engineers implement. She had not touched the production keys. In the microseconds between staging and production, she felt the weight of responsibility in an almost physical way. If this failed, the company might lose more. If it succeeded, she would have touched something larger than herself in a way that demanded humility. As the team prepared the production deploy, someone glanced at the 30-minute clock. Time now felt like a visible line on a map. 22 minutes, 23. The group clustered around the log streams. The deploy window had an expected latency. A few minutes for the change to be enacted, more minutes for the system to reach a new steady state, and then, if her hypothesis was right, the active connection curve would stop climbing and the 504 errors would begin to fall. Ricardo's phone buzzed constantly with messages from board members and investors. Every second the error persisted had a monetary cost. Patricia's jaw set as she thought of the ledgers. Outside, someone in the reception area made a joke that fell flat. The air was thin with tension. Carlos turned to Maia for confirmation. She met his glance and nodded once. "Roll it," she said. "Monitor for the usual suspects. Threat IDs that are still open, retry storms and any surge in latency. If we see any bad behavior, we roll back immediately, but start with the idle timeout change first, less intrusive, and then push the code later in the window if the curve doesn't respond." He gave a small professional smile. Good plan. He hit the enter key, a small decisive movement after hours of restraint. At that exact moment, the whiteboard in the corner showed the 30-minute count running down in real time. On the glass, the lobby's reflection looked like a second room, people going on, unaware of how close they were to the hinge of fortune. Hands hovered over keyboards, screens streamed log lines in an endless ribbon. Maia watched the graph, the active connections line trembling between a crest and a fall. She watched the 504 counters. She felt for the first time that morning the full measure of how small technical choices could become moral decisions. The choice to leave code messy for deadlines meant that someone somewhere might lose income when the system failed. She kept her attention calm and precise, because panic here would be contagious. 29 minutes. The chart dipped, barely perceptible. A single 504 error ticked down on a separate monitor. The room exhaled almost as one. But in environments like these, exhalations are provisional. There are false dawns and rebound failures. Maia kept her eyes soft, not letting a single drop of celebration leak into the air. Ricardo's posture loosened a fraction. He said nothing. The board members muttered. Marcelo quietly clapped Carlos on the shoulder.
Engineers who had been brittle with each other for the past 70 hours found themselves smiling at one another like people who had come through rain. At 30 minutes, the countdown signaled not a victory but a hinge. The idle timeout change had been applied. The graphs were beginning to show signs of the pool breathing again, not swelling inexorably. The 504 count, previously a steady drumbeat, had thinned to a trickle. Ricardo turned to the glass and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Good work. That's proof enough for now." The room relaxed, the way a muscle relaxes after being held taut too long. But relaxation is not a conclusion in operational work. It is a condition of readiness. There would be more tests, more validations, and the code fix still needed to be cemented across the system. Maia felt something shift inside of her as the gratitude from the room began to settle into apology and acknowledgement. People who had been barriers earlier in the morning now came forward with honest, human words. Marcelo approached her with a look that had humility behind it. "I'm sorry," he said, voice rough. "I didn't mean to shut you down. We were tired and defensive." Maia's smile was small. "No one's perfect in a crisis," she said. "We were focused. That's what gets you a system out of a hole. I'm glad we found it." Carlos added, "You were right to point at cleanup paths. We owe you coffee." There was laughter that broke something like formality. Patricia offered her a printed card, a kind, formal gesture of recognition. Ricardo extended an invitation to a proper debrief with the board.
The crowd around Maia started to tilt into a new shape, not of spectacle, but of colleagues reconfiguring respect. But not everyone in the room had settled into a new story. Some faces were still guarded, still recovering from the strain of 3 days without success. The news feeds would care more about headlines than about careful attribution. In the glow of the monitors, Maia could see how fragile reputations are, how quickly trust can be rebuilt, and how slowly it can be earned. A senior board member, Dr. Fernando Oliveira, whose voice usually stopped meetings with a single sentence, stepped forward. He was an elder presence, a man who had seen many companies through collapses and recoveries. "This is a lesson," he said, "not just in code, but in how we listen." His words were not directed only at the engineers or the CEO. They were a small public recognition of the cost of closed ears. Maia's hands trembled slightly, not from the adrenaline, but from the sudden lightness of being recognized. This moment had not been about title or ceremony. It had been about a clear line of cause and effect. Observe, hypothesize, test. It had been about the overlooked paths in code and in people. Ricardo pulled Maia aside for a brief conversation in the corner, away from the cameras, away from the now cracking laughter of engineers.
He looked at her with a complicated expression, gratitude mixed with the practical hunger of a CEO who had nearly lost everything. "You did what 30 engineers couldn't," he said plainly. "I'd like you to join a post-mortem and, well, maybe consider a position. We need people who can see what others don't." Maia felt the old pull of career doors opening. She had not thought of herself as someone who would accept a job immediately. She had a life built on smaller, more immediate needs. But she had also always wanted to return to engineering on her own terms, to be valued for ability, not only for an innocuous, temporary fix. She kept her expression steady, the practiced humility of someone who had learned to ask for small things and be grateful for any opportunity. "Thank you," she said, "but I want to make sure this isn't just about me. We need to look at hiring practices, testing, and how we evaluate experience and merit. There are talented people who'll never be in rooms like this because the bar we use to judge them is wrong." Ricardo's eyes sharpened at that. He liked the idea of a program. It sounded like something he could market. But for him, the first need was survival, ensuring service resilience and regaining client trust. Patricia, who had her own quiet, steady pragmatism, interrupted them with the next item on the crisis checklist: audits, rollback verification, and communicating to customers. Before Maia left the building that afternoon, a few details remained unsettled. The hotfix had not yet been fully rolled across all clusters. Metrics needed longer observation to prove stability. The board wanted a written post-mortem that could be shared with clients. And there was the intangible work of shifting culture, how to make tech flow a place where a delivery worker could speak up and be heard without having to be tested by a seemingly cruel ultimatum. As Maia walked out into the Sao Paulo light, the yellow backpack feeling heavier with possibility than with parcels, she glimpsed a future path. Not just a job offer, but a chance to change how companies find talent. She thought of friends who had brilliant project portfolios, but no formal experience, and of nights hunched over university lab work while hiring managers judged by years rather than by capacity. She thought of the small injustices that stack up over time, how resumes are filtered, and how people are dismissed because they do not look like the conventional candidate. The city around her carried on with indifferent momentum. Buses, street vendors, a man playing accordion at the corner, the small commerce of people making a living. Maia felt oddly both very small and very large in that flow. Her phone buzzed with messages from her mother. Her mother's voice in the message was soft and proud, the kind of pride that wraps the full complexity of a day into a single smile. She sat on a bench outside the building and opened the backpack to check the processors.
They were still sealed. She took a breath and let herself feel the odd mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had not yet decided whether to accept Ricardo's offer. What mattered now was the next step, making sure the fix held and that the conversation about talent and hiring turned into something more than corporate talk. She thought of the 30 minutes, not as a spectacle, but as a rigorous narrowness that forced clarity. She thought of the pattern she had seen in the logs and how it echoed patterns in hiring. The same blind spots repeated until someone from a different vantage point points them out. Before she stood to leave, Carlos found her on the bench. He had been the ally who had opened the door. He sat down beside her, looking like someone who had gotten through a trial and realized the relief had an aftertaste. "You're staying for the debrief, right?" he asked. "We could use you in the presentation."
Maia smiled. "I'll be there," she said, "but I want to ask for one thing. When this is fixed, can we design a way to test for talent that doesn't rely only on who's worked at the right companies? Practical tests, projects, internships, paid ones. People can't afford to work unpaid to prove themselves." Carlos nodded slowly, and in that nod there was a promise and a weight. He could be an ally in the team's inner conversation about hiring reform, or he could be another face that admires and moves on. They both stood. The street was loud, the kind of Sao Paulo noise that makes human dramas feel simultaneously private and public. Maia adjusted her backpack and walked away from the building, carrying with her a list of follow-up tasks and a strangely urgent moral inventory. She knew this was only the beginning. At the end of the day, TechFlow's dashboards would need hours of steady metrics before anyone pronounced the fix permanent. The company had been saved from the immediate storm, but the deeper work, making systems resilient by design and making hiring equitable by design, had only just begun. The voices that had been silent in the room all morning would need a seat at the table. Maia's presence had shifted the room. Whether it would change the room's rules was the real question. When she reached her scooter, the city light hitting the yellow of the backpack, she checked her watch. The time felt like a hinge between two stories, the small one of an afternoon saved and the large one of a future being redesigned. She breathed in, tasting diesel and rain, and headed home. Behind her, in the glass box of the operations room, the team prepared the next steps: extended monitoring windows, code audits, and a draft for the post-mortem. They had the first data that suggested the pool leak was arrested, but they knew, as engineers do, that early signals can be misleading. They would watch for regressions.
They would test the patch in more clusters, verify analytics jobs across regions, and ensure that the temporary timeout tweak did not create other unintended consequences. In the quiet after the storm, a plan began to take shape. Not only fixes to code, but a program to find the kind of talent Maia represented, people with technical acuity who had not been given the usual markers of experience. The idea was tentative, a scrawled note on a whiteboard between pipeline diagrams, talents hidden. It would need resources, structure, and proof, and it would need people willing to be changed by the evidence that talent is often invisible until systems are tuned to notice it. Maia rode her scooter through the city, thinking of the small injustices and the small technical details that aggregate to systemic failure. She had proved something in 30 minutes, but the real work, designing systems that do not fail because of overlooked paths, and designing hiring processes that do not discard unconventional competence, would take months, perhaps years. That evening, as she crossed the bridge over the Pinedos River, the city lights reflecting like scattered LEDs, she felt a quiet determination bloom. Today had been a diagnosis, tomorrow would be a set of actions, and somewhere beyond the assessment and the hotfix and the headlines, there would be a bench of candidates, people like Bruno and Alex and Raphael, who simply needed doors opened in ways that recognized ability, not only pedigree. She did not yet know how to build that program. She would sleep on it, but she knew how to start, by insisting that the post-mortem include not only technical remediation, but also a plan for talent discovery, fair assessments, and paid internships. She knew it because she had lived the margin. Inside the operations room, clocks ticked, monitors hummed. The engineers, no longer on the verge of collapse, began to plan for longer-term stability. The immediate crisis had bent toward containment, but the longer narrative, the one that would ask whether a single afternoon's intervention could become institutional learning, had yet to be written. The room buzzed with the first tentative drafts of that learning. And somewhere in the quiet of her apartment, Maia opened a notebook and began to write down a framework: short practical assessments, project-based evaluation, paid practicum spots that would not force people to work for free. She drew boxes, timelines, and a simple sentence at the top: find talent where it's hiding. She stopped at a small, precise thought. Changing hiring was not charity, it was prudence. Companies that learned to see differently would be more resilient, not only technically, but culturally. Talent. The days after the hotfix were methodical in a way the crisis itself had not been. The immediate tremors of the outage had softened into a long, careful assessment.
TechFlow's operations team extended their monitoring windows. They ran targeted load tests against the reporting job. They reviewed every place where connections were opened and where cleanup might be skipped. The charts that had once been angry red lines now bore careful annotations and small green ticks where behavior matched expectation. Maia stayed close enough to watch, but far enough to let the engineers own the execution. That had been the condition from the start. She could point, interpret, and insist on thoroughness, but she would not step into their deployment consoles and pretend she had lived with the code for years. That division kept trust intact and let the team learn the lesson as their own. Marcelo, who had been defensive in the beginning, began to sit with her in the same room for post-mortem sessions. His posture changed from bristling to thoughtful as he walked through the places where deadlines had allowed messy paths to endure. The post-mortem that followed was brutal in its honesty and humane in its tone. A public blame-free audit is a rare thing. TechFlow attempted it intentionally. They documented the sequence of events, the small decisions that added up, the hurried reporting job pushed live during a product sprint, the to-do comments left unaddressed, the lack of a guardrail in exception paths. They also documented the architecture gaps, insufficient instrumentation for long-running background jobs, alert thresholds that focused on caller latency but not on internal resource exhaustion, and a change control process that made emergency patches possible but awkward. From those pages came two parallel projects, one technical, one cultural. Technically, the company adopted a suite of changes that read like responsible engineering, better instrumentation that surfaced connection lifecycle events, automatic alerts when pools reached a high watermark, fuller test coverage for exception paths, and templates for resource management that mandated closure semantics in every new service. They added guardrails in the deployment pipeline, automated canary checks that validated connection counts and session churn before rolling any code broadly. They also implemented a temporary policy for reporting jobs. Longer-running aggregation tasks were moved to isolated execution pools with stricter quotas so they couldn't accidentally choke the general request path. Maia was not the one writing most of that code, but she wrote the small set of rules that reframed how TechFlow asked questions of its engineers. She proposed that every service be instrumented with simple health signals that were easy to read by any non-expert: open connections, average session duration, and a recent count of cleanup events. That last metric, something she had suggested in the heat of the 30-minute test, became the frontline diagnostic tool the operations team kept on a slim dashboard.
If connection cleanup did not keep pace with opens, the system would show it clearly. Culturally, the work was harder. 2 generations of hiring and evaluation habits had to be questioned. Maia's own entry into the company, pushed by a CEO in a moment of desperation, had laid bare a truth many found uncomfortable. Talent can be occluded by a CV filter. The HR team, which had been structured around conventional markers, years at certain companies, a list of accepted institutions, signals of prior corporate experience, listened as Maia described what she had seen and what she wanted to change. The proposal she sketched at her kitchen table that night, the first version of Talents Hidden, was deliberately simple. It had 3 pillars: practical assessment, paid entry tracks, and evidence-based mentorship. Practical assessment meant replacing an over-reliance on resumes with short, timed problem sets or small projects that candidates could complete remotely and that were evaluated anonymously. Paid entry tracks meant that any internship or practicum inside TechFlow would be compensated. No one should have to work for free to prove competence. Evidence-based mentorship meant pairing candidates with senior engineers who were assessed on their ability to teach, not just their velocity of code. That last part worried some executives. Mentorship is costly. Training is costly. Patricia, the CFO, asked the questions executives must ask. What would this cost? What would the return be? Maia answered with a sentence she repeated often in the coming months: short-term investment, long-term resilience. She argued that by widening the funnel to include people who had not followed conventional pathways, the company could tap disciplined, passionate talent that often went unrecognized, and at the same time, reduce the brittle homogeneity that had contributed to the oversight in the first place. They started small. A pilot cohort of 12 people, names drawn from community groups, university project lists, and referrals, was assembled. Each applicant completed an online, anonymous practical task focused on reasoning rather than memorized knowledge. Some wrote a short script to demonstrate safe resource handling. Others explained, in a step-by-step narrated recording, how they would instrument a small service to detect resource leakage. The assessments were judged by a mixed panel of engineers and Maia herself. The criteria valued clarity of thought, evidence of methodical debugging, and the ability to express trade-offs. Among the first cohort were Bruno, Alex, and Raphael, 3 stories that would come to stand for the program's promise. Bruno had been a customer support technician for years. He knew systems from the outside, how users described failure, which terms they used, what panic sounded like in a support ticket. He had taught himself SQL and small scripting on nights between shifts.
His practical assessment was a short task about tracing request flows. His submission was incomplete in Polish, but ferociously clear about cause and effect. He was offered a paid practicum on TechFlow's monitoring team, and in time moved into a role where his empathy for users shaped alert thresholds so they reflected real-world pain, not abstract metrics. Alex had learned to code through online communities. He'd built a small open-source tool for personal budgeting that several friends used. He lacked the corporate experience boxes on a typical checklist, but his project demonstrated disciplined testing and careful resource handling. In the program, he paired with Marcelo, who was initially hesitant but grew into a teacher who valued clear explanations over clever solutions. Alex's tenacity and attention to edge cases made him an excellent reliability engineer. Raphael's background was a quilt of informal jobs and night classes. He spoke softly, then demonstrated a fierce ability to model systems. He had, in a storefront internship years earlier, written a small batch import process that worked until it didn't. Then he methodically instrumented it to find a subtle concurrency issue. In the Talents Hidden track, Raphael led a small initiative that audited background jobs across TechFlow's fleet and proposed a template for safe concurrency that reduced incident surface. Each of their stories was distinct, but the through line was the same: ability often hid behind non-traditional resumes. The program's success narratives became the currency that earned its space inside TechFlow's budget debates. Patricia, who had once asked about cost, now used the program's early outcomes to justify further investment. Our churn was partly cultural, she said in a board meeting. We were hiring sameness and losing the kind of curiosity that saves a system. The CFO's framing shifted the conversation from charity to prudence, and that shift mattered. The pilot did not go perfectly. Some recruits found the corporate pace jarring. Some mentors struggled to teach without slipping back into how we do it at TechFlow assumptions. There were mistakes, an improperly scoped task that led to long hours for one intern, a miscommunication about evaluation criteria, and the inevitable bureaucratic frictions that come when legal and compliance have to reconcile paid internships with local labor rules. Every misstep was documented, discussed openly, and corrected. What changed fastest was the hiring funnel. TechFlow's HR team introduced blind evaluation of the initial practical tasks. Resumes were hidden until later in the process. The company redefined experience to include demonstratable project work, even if not paid, and added more weight to testable problem-solving and mentoring feedback. Hiring managers, forced to examine candidates on clearer, observable skills, found a different range of profiles emerging. People who thought deeply about failure modes, who had tested systems in small production contexts, who had built reliable tools for small communities. The engineers, those who had once bristled at a delivery woman's entrance, began to speak of a change in the air. Marcelo became a vocal supporter of the program, and his involvement had meaning beyond optics. He had been humbled by what happened during the outage. He had learned that pride could blind even the best minds. His willingness to mentor Alex and to speak about the dangers of ship-first habits lent the program internal legitimacy. Carlos, who had been an early ally, took on the formal role of technical liaison with the program, ensuring that practicum tasks were meaningful and that mentors were trained. As months passed, the program's results accumulated, not as grand pronouncements, but as steady improvements. Teams reported fewer production incidents tied to background tasks. New hires from the program integrated and stayed longer than expected, and the company's internal surveys showed small but clear gains in psychological safety. People felt more comfortable speaking up when they saw odd patterns. Outside TechFlow, the story percolated. Local tech meetups invited Maia and a few of the pilot hires to speak about the program's approach to assessment. A state university reached out, not to endorse the program, but to study its methodology and interview graduates. Someone from the Municipal Workforce Office asked for a briefing on the paid practicum model because the idea of compensating trainees resonated with policy discussions about fair work. The press wrote pieces that were careful to avoid sensationalism. The narrative was not one delivery girl fixes a company, but rather an outsider's question revealed a common blind spot, and a company learned to change. With that attention came pressure. Some managers worried about the optics.
Would other companies use a similar program and hire away their top recruits? Would competitors mimic the assessment and beat TechFlow in recruitment? Maia and the leadership team answered with another simple reframing. Talents Hidden was not a moat, but a lens. A company that learned to evaluate fairly would get safer and more resilient. Better retention, deeper institutional memory, and improved incident response were the byproducts. The program's name, Talents Hidden, mattered. It declared that what companies tried to find was sometimes hidden in plain sight, obscured by filters and habits. Maia insisted on the plural. It wasn't a single hero she had discovered. It was a pattern of people, careful thinkers, dedicated builders, and resilient problem solvers, whose paths did not fit traditional narratives. Institutionalizing the program required formal structures.
Maia helped design a governance board that included engineers, an HR representative, a legal advisor, and a member from operations. The board met monthly to evaluate the program's outcomes, adjust criteria, and refine mentorship practices. They created a checklist for practicum projects, measurable goals, defined mentorship hours, and a compensation floor that made the positions accessible. One afternoon, months after the outage, Raphael walked into the operations room with a small stack of printouts. He was no longer tentative. His voice carried a steady confidence. He and Bruno had co-authored a short internal paper describing a set of common patterns in background processing across the company, patterns that often led to resource leaks. The paper wasn't academic, it was practical, with checklists, remediation examples, and a recommendation for a shared library that enforced safe closure semantics. Marcelo read it, and, in front of the team, suggested they adopt several of its suggestions as defaults. Those moments, the small triumphs of influence, built a culture that began to look different. People of varied backgrounds took turns presenting in the weekly blameless incident reviews. The operations war room that used to be a closed club now had a rotating seat for someone from Talents Hidden. The company's annual engineering review included a new metric, diversity of experience in teams, measured not as token numbers, but as distribution of different career backgrounds across projects. Externally, interest grew. A nearby university asked to study TechFlow's postmortem methodology and the Talents Hidden selection model. A government labor office requested a briefing on compensated practicum frameworks to inform policy debate. Maia, who had once been relieved at the thought of a simple job offer, now found herself preparing slide decks and talking points about assessment design, about how to measure competency without excluding those who couldn't afford unpaid internships. She learned how to translate what she'd done in a crisis into repeatable processes. She learned to write policy language that satisfied legal teams. She learned to speak publicly without inflating the role she had played. When journalists called, she declined grandiosity. "We did not save the company by magic," she said in one interview. "We found a pattern and fixed it in collaboration. What matters is the systems we build after the fact so the same mistake doesn't repeat." Scaling the program required patience. TechFlow piloted the model in its Sao Paulo office, then extended it to 2 regional teams. They rented small stipends funds, coordinated with legal on employment terms, and created a lightweight online assessment suite that mirrored the pilot's practical tasks. The team working on the program, the people who had seen the first cohort through, grew into a formal internal group.
Maia, who had balanced deliveries and doubts for months, accepted a role that straddled engineering and talent design, a position where she could continue to influence technical choices while owning the program's day-to-day build-out. Her appointment came with caveats: no ceremonial title inflation, no immediate promotions to executive ranks. The company wanted measurable outcomes and a steady, accountable rollout. Maia welcomed that. Her own humility, sharpened by the 30-minute crucible, made her reluctant to become a figurehead. She wanted systems that outlived her presence. In the quieter moments among the paperwork and presentations, she pushed for one practical thread: maintain a culture of curiosity. She wanted teams to ask whether their assumptions were artifacts of convenience. "We should assume we're wrong until we prove otherwise," she told new mentors. It sounded extreme, but in practice it meant creating routine rituals, simple check-ins where junior engineers or interns were invited to present anomalies they'd noticed, and senior engineers were rewarded not just for catching bugs, but for creating contexts where anomalies could be noticed early. As the program matured, its early critics softened into constructive skeptics. Marcelo, once defensive, now recommended young developers for follow-up programs. Carlos, who had introduced Maia to the team and who had been the friend whose curiosity first pierced the glass, became a vocal advocate for praxis-driven evaluation. Patricia continued to balance cost and value, but as metrics from the program's early cohorts showed improved retention and steady contributions, her memos shifted from caution to sponsorship. A year after the outage, TechFlow hosted a modest conference for other local companies and universities to describe their experience. Maia was nervous about stepping onto a stage, even a small one. Public speaking was not her default skill set. But the room listened, not to the story of a dramatic rescue, but to the pragmatic account of a diagnosis turned into policy. She spoke about patterns.
She explained plainly and with diagrams what a connection pool was and why orphaned sessions mattered. She cautioned against magical thinking. The fix in their case had been evidence-based and required coordinated execution. She described the scaffolding: practical assessments that revealed pattern recognition and humility, paid practical tracks that removed the economic barrier to proving ability, mentorship that emphasized teaching and psychological safety. She framed the program's outcomes candidly: the anecdotal success stories, Bruno's transition from support into monitoring, Alex's growth into reliability engineering, Raphael's templated concurrency patterns now used across teams, were balanced with admissions of missteps. She described the legal conversations, the need for ongoing funding, and the importance of rigorous measurement.
Universities were studying the model's metrics, and a municipal labor office had asked for a briefing. TechFlow had not become a miracle factory overnight. It had become a company conscious of how it recognized talent. During the Q&A, a young engineering manager asked the question that mattered most. How do you avoid turning this into a checkbox? How do you keep from gaming the assessments? Maia answered with the same method she used on the logs. Rotate the assessments. Involve multiple evaluators. Make mentorship evaluation part of the mentor's performance review. Keep the tasks close to the problems you actually face in production. And remember, humility can't be a rubric. It has to be a lived practice. Leaders who accept they may be wrong, and systems that let others point it out without punishment. The conference closed with practical takeaways rather than fanfare. Companies swapped contact information, universities asked for copies of the program's methodology, a government representative requested a closed briefing. Maia walked off stage feeling tired and oddly buoyed. The job she had once longed for had become a vocation that reached into institutions. Back at TechFlow, life continued with fewer dramatic outages and more predictable improvements. The operations room still had its alarms, but alarms are not failures. They are prompts to action. Engineers still worked late on Fridays, people still made mistakes. But the company had a new habit. They tested assumptions systematically. Months later, on a gray Sao Paulo morning, Maia sat in a small auditorium where a regional tech alliance convened. She had been invited not as a novelty, but because people wanted to hear about how to build better hiring pipelines. She listened to other speakers, academics, policymakers, HR professionals, and found herself thinking less about hero narratives and more about institutional designs, how to make compensation fair, how to ensure that short-term hires did not become exploitation, how to codify mentorship in ways that rewarded teaching. That afternoon, she received a message from her mother, a short voice note that said simply and with pride, "You're doing good work." Maia listened to it twice and let the sound of that small domestic thing steady her. At home that night, she opened the notebook she'd started months earlier, the one that had once said, "Find talent where it's hiding." The notebook had grown into a manual, templates for assessments, legal clauses, a flowchart for onboarding, a code of conduct for mentors, and a short set of metrics that mattered: retention at 6 months, production incident attribution, and mentee satisfaction. She added one more note in the margin: insist on humility. That, she believed, had been as important as any technical change. It was humility, an organizational disposition to listen to unusual voices, that allowed an observation at a lobby window to turn into an actionable hypothesis. Her role changed too.
She had been offered a formal position that combined product reliability work with program leadership. Part of the appeal was the ability to make change at scale. Part was the chance to mentor others who were like the people she once had been: brilliant, overlooked, and patient. She negotiated the terms with care. The role would include funding for paid practicums, a small team of operations engineers to shepherd candidate projects, and a direct line to the executive team, so the program's recommendations could translate quickly into product practice. Ricardo, once a man of sharp ultimatums, had become more restrained, and in private moments, reflective. He liked practical results. The program produced them. Patricia's spreadsheets grew kinder toward creative investments. Dr. Fernando, who had a habit of speaking rarely and with weight, publicly praised the company's willingness to learn. The chorus of small acknowledgments mattered because they signaled that the program was not a PR stunt, but an institutional change. There were skeptics, of course. Some argued that the program's success stories were survivorship bias, examples selected because they shone. Maia welcomed that critique. It forced the program team to publish transparent metrics and to make their methodology reproducible. They created public summaries of their assessment designs and anonymized outcomes. They invited external academics to study retention and performance. That willingness to open doors to scrutiny hardened the program's credibility. One evening, months later, a former hiring manager who had been skeptical came to Maia with a question. "I was wrong," he said.
I still don't know everything you do, but I see it now. How can I help? The offer was small and human, a gesture of reparation that meant more than words. Maia did not need apologies. She needed allies. She accepted. The years that followed did not dissolve into a tidy utopia. Companies still have failures. Software still produces surprises. But TechFlow developed an institutional muscle. When something odd appeared in metrics, teams listened to people who noticed it, wherever they came from. The company built default templates for safe resource handling and created a culture where someone could point at a log and be heard without the room rehearsing its defenses. At a national conference convened 2 years after the outage, Maia stood on a stage with several of the program's alumni. Bruno, now program lead for monitoring, Alex, now a reliability engineer with a small team, and Raphael, who led an internal initiative to centralize safe execution patterns. Each told a short story, how the practicum had given them a base, how a mentor had changed the way they approached edge cases, how a paid internship had allowed them to afford to try. The stories were not dramatic rescues. They were narratives of steady work, of doors opening and people stepping through.
The room applauded, but the applause did not feel like trumpet blasts. It felt like a community noting progress. In the crowd were HR directors, engineers, policy analysts, and students. Representatives from a university near Sao Paulo asked about collaborating on formal studies. Someone from a municipal workforce program discussed piloting similar practicum models. A small delegation from another tech company asked for the assessment templates. After the panel, a young woman from outside the city tapped Maia on the shoulder. She held a small piece of paper with a URL scribbled on it, the site where the program's short one-page summary lived. "I'm studying systems engineering," she said. "I didn't get callbacks. I've been building projects on my own. Your program seems like a way to be seen. How do I try?" Maia looked at her, and for a moment the long arc of the past 2 years telescoped into a single tender instant. She remembered the smell of the lobby, the cold coffee, the watch that had been a metronome for a personal hinge. She saw herself 8 months before, delivering packages, carrying sealed processors, learning to steady in rooms that assumed she didn't belong. She could have kept that moment to herself, but she had used it to build a program. "You apply," she said, and handed over a printed card with the program's link. "Do the assessment. We'll look at the work, not only where you worked. And if it fits, you'll get paid while you learn." The young woman smiled, a small, incredulous smile that carried the weight of someone who had been holding in hope for a long time. "Thank you," she said. On the way home, as the city lights blurred into streaks and the evening traffic hummed, Maia thought about the title the press had given the story months earlier, a headline that cast her as a singular savior. She did not like grandiosity, but she understood why the headline sold papers. Stories need hooks. What mattered to her was different. The systems she and others had put in place so that a single person's observation would not be the only way a problem was surfaced. She had turned down a big, flashy executive title in favor of work that built capacity. In the quiet of her apartment, she taped a small note to the inside of her notebook cover: "Make structures, not legends." The note was both instruction and defense against the temptation to accept myth-making as a substitute for sustained labor. Years later, when she spoke to a national audience about institutional change, she framed the episode not as a miracle but as a method. She spoke of the diagnostic habit, observe, hypothesize, test, and of cultural humility, structures that encourage unusual voices to be heard without tests that humiliate. She argued for practical assessment over pedigree, for paid internships that reduce economic barriers, and for continuous instrumentation that translates mystery into data. The company nearly lost itself on a small oversight, she would say.
30 engineers had given their nights to a problem. That was real expertise and real sacrifice. But expertise can be blinkered. Openness to being corrected by a delivery worker, by a novice, by anyone who notices a pattern, saved us. That openness must become policy. When the audience asked whether a similar program would work elsewhere, she answered simply, "Systems are different, but the principle is the same. Make the invisible visible. Reward teaching. Compensate learning. Listen." The applause at the conference was warm. People lined up to ask detailed questions. Universities took copies of the program's methodology. Government offices scheduled briefings. TechFlow's HR team shared templates. Companies across the region experimented with pilot cohorts. The idea of talents hidden became not a brand, but a methodology that others could adapt. In the quiet after the applause, Maia walked outside and breathed Sao Paulo air that tasted of rain and gasoline and possibility. She thought of the 30 minutes, the compressed window that had forced precision, and of the longer work that followed, months of pilot cohorts, government's meetings, code audits, and legal memos. She thought of Bruno, Alex, and Raphael, of the mentors who learned to teach, of Marcelo's change of posture, and of Carlo's steady professionalism. Her victory, such as it was, had never felt like a personal coronation. It had felt like a responsibility owed,
to make sure the observation she'd offered that morning made room for others. That responsibility had become a career. She smiled, not at headlines or at the neatness of an arc, but at the small, durable things that sustain organizations. The inclination to ask why patterns repeat, the patience to instrument small signals before they swell, and the moral imperative to pay people while they prove themselves. Those were not sensational, they were sensible. As she walked back toward the folding doors of the venue, she thought of the lobby where she had once been a delivery worker with sealed processors and a yellow backpack. The memory had been a hinge. Everything that followed had been the careful work of turning that hinge into an open door. 30 engineers had been exhausted. 30 engineers had labored in shifts and come up short. But what shifted the narrative was not a single person's audacity. It was a system's willingness to be changed by evidence and a company's decision to make room, structurally and financially, for people who had not had conventional access. Maia had not turned everything around by herself. She had pointed, persisted, and then used the opening to build structures that could see talent when it was hiding. If you want to learn more about how the talent's hidden method works, how practical assessments are designed, how paid practicums are structured, and how to implement simple instrumentation for resource leaks, there's a short one-page summary available in the description.
If this story speaks to the work you do, share it with someone who needs to hear that fresh perspective and practical humility can change systems from the inside out.